My name's Nick. I work with heritage organisations all over the world, help them tell all of our story, the story of our shared cultural identity. So when I was thinking about the theme of collaboration, I wanted to talk about the story of a place where I felt the spirit of collaboration most strongly. About 2 years ago, I was invited to travel to South Africa to work with a network of museums out there called Ether, Ether standing for Eternal Heritage. And it was the first time I'd travelled to and discovered the glorious country of South Africa. I'm sure many of you will have been there. It has a population of some 53 million people. It has 11 recognised languages and has a fair claim to being one of the most diverse, one of the most multi-ethnic cultures on earth. As I'm sure many of you will know, in 1948, the National Party came to power in South Africa and brought in, building on previous segregationist policies of the Dutch and the English, brought in the policy of apartheid. Apartheid meaning aparthood or segregation, the very definition of being against the spirit and principle of collaboration. And that policy, which was ushered in 48, began to crumble in the 70s, as you know, but it wasn't until the national election in 1994, when the African National Congress came to power, that the policies of apartheid were formally and finally unpicked, and South Africa began fully to rebuild. And so the question, I guess, that I found when I was travelling out to South Africa is 20 years on after the end of that. How do you begin to unpick a legacy that was about destroying collaboration, was about destroying the very principle and idea of respect and of unity? And the way, in some ways, that those communities of South Africa are going about that process is through building museums. And I wanted to share some of these very, very special places with you. The first is the District 6 Museum. Now, I don't know if any of you have been to the District 6 Museum. District 6 was a part of Cape Town in South Africa. It had around 60,000 inhabitants. It was a place of tremendous creativity and art and excitement and joy. And on the 11th of February 1966, the government decided that it was to become a whites-only area. So they moved in the bulldozers with almost no warning, and they destroyed the homes of 60,000 people in Cape Town. And over the years, the people were displaced to another settlement just outside Cape Town, further along the coast. They formed a foundation, and they went back and made the case for reparation for what they'd lost. What they'd lost was community, with collaboration, was people supporting one another. They'd lost the entire fabric of their identity. The places that they lived, they grew and they were born and they died in. And that's what happened to it. It became a wasteland on the outside of Cape Town. That's what it looks like today. Sadly, not always with these fantastic chaps in purple shirts, but you know, it stands as an empty and a barren place. And so when they were making representation to the government for reparation, basically to be paid back for what they'd lost, they found a building just on the edges of District 6, and that's where they held the hearings about who'd lived there, what they were owed, what they deserved to have in the way of reparation. And to support those hearings, they drew a map on the ground, because there wasn't a map of Cape Town, so they drew a map out and they began to handwrite their stories on the map. My family lived here, my mother died here, this is where we were. And they tried to rebuild a sense of that place. Now, right in the middle of this museum stands this sort of totem pole. One of the bulldozer drivers decided, as he was laying waste to this community, that he'd save the street signs from the streets on the corners of the houses. And so he collected them. And then when this building stopped being a place of civic action and public hearing, became a museum, he donated them to the museum, and they rebuilt the central point of the community with the street signs pointing in the directions of the original streets. And this map became a public document, a shared collaborative map of the history of a place that had disappeared forever and could never be rebuilt. So they laid it over with plastic, and it now forms the floor of the museum. You can walk over this map and you look down and you can read all of the stories of the people that lived and died in this community. So I felt a tremendously strong spirit of collaboration, reparation, emerging from District 6. We then travelled to work with this museum, the Luthuli Museum, which is in a township called Groutville, just outside Durban. I sat in the garden of this place. Chief Albert Luthuli was the first black South African to win the Nobel Peace Prize. He won the 1960 prize but wasn't allowed to travel to accept it until 1961. And Chief Albert Luthuli was a colleague of Mandela's and part of the peaceful struggle for reunification, for bringing African society back together, and felt the spirit of this place where kings and monarchs and tyrants and terrorists had come together to sit in that garden with this guy and to talk about the principles of apartheid and how it could be overcome. And one of the things that was in a joint article that Luthuli wrote with Mandela is that if you want to make peace with your enemy, you must work with him, and then he becomes your partner. And I think one of the most important things about the spirit of collaboration that I found in these places is that spirit of forgiveness in collaboration, which allowed them then to rebuild over the last 20 years. This is Luthuli travelling to Oslo to accept the Nobel Prize in 1961. And all over South Africa, these museums are emerging, these places of civic pride and history and memory, where people are collaborating between black communities, white communities, people from all social strata and walks of life, to look at the story of the apartheid era in South Africa, and through looking at it, through holding it up, to come to understand it, and hopefully through coming to understand it, to be able to move on and to build a stronger, a united country. So they've taken in the process the machinery of apartheid. A lot of these museums are built in the offices where people were issued with their passes, without which they weren't allowed to travel. And so they've appropriated the machinery of separation, of apartheid, and they've turned it into a collaborative place for meaning and reconstruction. This finally then is a very special place called the Red Location Museum in Port Elizabeth. The Red Location, so called because it was one of the sites of the first and bloodiest civic uprisings against holding passes. People refused to carry their passes to be allowed to go in and work on the railways. What used to happen when young men usually would travel from rural communities into the cities to find work, they would take with them a memory box. They'd take with them a small cardboard box that contained memories of their family and their friends and their homes. And so this museum is built around a series of vast memory boxes, great big shipping container sized boxes that you walk between on your own in reflection. And so what you're doing when you stand inside these memory boxes that are filled with the memories of particular individuals who either died in that place or worked in that place or lived in that place, is you're collaborating with them to understand their life and to understand what their life has to tell you about the way you live your life today. So what we're doing with these museums in the spirit of collaboration is telling the story of our common cultural heritage, because it's only by collaborating with people past, people today, that we're going to be able to design a stronger and a more unified future. So that's what I learned about collaboration from South African museums. Thank you very much for listening.